essentially a law that's a full-on assault on civil liberties issues, thought crime, criminalization of dissent, and it's really a trajectory long-standing in American history dating back to 1798 in the Alien and Sedition Acts. And of course, this is something that has been more and more ongoing post 9/11, from things like the USA Patriot Act and Homeland Security Act up through the Military Commissions Act and so on. And this act didn't pass Congress. It wasn't made into a law. We're going to let our speaker tonight talk more about that. But this is, again, a very crucial issue, and it was virtually blacked out by the mainstream press, mainstream media. Not a lot of coverage at all about this issue on civil liberties. So I just wanted to make a few brief remarks about this issue of civil liberties, and of course, after our speaker is finished this evening with Q&A, I'm actually going to do a little bit of talking about historical context and why this is such an important story. And really why we should take it a lot, certainly more seriously than the corporate mainstream press has taken it. They have taken it for anything. They have ignored it. It's not even on the radar for these groups. But this issue of a crackdown on civil liberties and a limitation of civil liberties is, again, long-standing. And if you've looked at the history of Project Censored, these civil liberty stories have long been covered. You know, if you go back and look in previous years, Project Censored has always looked at these civil liberties concerns and the lack of coverage in corporate media. In fact, just in the last 2 volumes of Project Censored, if you go back to the 2008 book, story number 1 was on Military Commissions Act and the suspension of habeas corpus. Story number 2 was on martial law and sort of a repeal of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. All of this is now in the news yet again. A recent article by Naomi Wolf on Alternet talking about the use of American troops on American soil for domestic policing. Even though the Supreme Court overruled and declared unconstitutional parts of the Military Commission Act on habeas corpus, the Bush administration has dragged their feet and continued to ignore that enforcement. So this is, again, a very significant issue, and it's something that Project Censored has been dealing with for quite a while, unfortunately. Story number 6 in the 2008 book was on the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, again, targeting specific people in the society and limiting civil liberties. In fact, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act has many egregious elements and components to it, and there are several people in prison under that law right now. It is again, a very officious reach into the society to curtail freedom of expression, dissent, and more information, again, can be found on the Project Censored website. If you don't have a 2008 book, projectcensored.org, you can look in the archive stories for the links to all of these stories. Story 20 was the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Story number 6 of 2008 dealt with the Falcon raids and the deputization of people in the business community to essentially turn in allegedly suspicious characters. And the Falcon raids have dragged in over 54,000 people that were, again, allegedly violent and suspects and felons and so forth. And actually what we discovered from a lot of the people that were round up, what seems to be rather arbitrarily in the Falcon raids, a vast majority of these people were not violent offenders. They were not sex offenders like the government had said they were. In fact, most of them were nonviolent drug offenders, which relates to story 20 in the 2009 book about record arrests for nonviolent marijuana users. So again, there's a lot of themes here on civil liberties that just keep churning on. The mainstream media is ignoring. And it's, again, these are things that we clearly ignore to our peril. Also in the 2009 book, of course, in addition to story number 6 on homegrown terrorism that we're going to hear about here this evening, we also have story number 3 and number 5, where we have FBI further deputizing people under InfraGard as, well, what isn't an extension technically of the Falcon raids, but it certainly appears to be more outreach by government to privatize things like domestic policing and security. Freezing war protesters' assets by executive order is story number 5 in the 2009 book. Again, another civil liberties kind of a story, cracking down on people for dissent and for exercising First Amendment rights. Another story clearly ignored by the corporate press. Story number 8 this year in 2009 about secret executive orders, about how the president can sign secret executive orders, change executive orders secretly, or not even follow his own executive orders without anyone knowing about it. There's no oversight whatsoever. Story, again, 20 this year we mentioned as the marijuana arrest story. Again, another civil liberties approach. Chapter 5 in the '09 book this year by former Associate Director Andy Roth. Follows Military Commissions Act coverage. So that was story 1 last year, and this year we have a follow-up on it. Again, a very important civil liberties story, and the way the mainstream press covers it, and when they do cover it, how they frame it to pretend that there's actually a debate about things as important as habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a constitutional right. Not only that, it's been in Western law since Magna Carta of 1215. I don't mean quarter after noon. I mean almost 800 years of habeas corpus law stripped through the Military Commissions Act. And the newspaper coverage of that has been excessively appalling because, again, it manufactures a debate out of thin air where there isn't one. There's a faux debate going on about, well, do we really have rights of habeas corpus and due process? We do, and any literate person that's read the Constitution would know that. But not according to the corporate media. They seem to be able to manufacture phony debates, again, right out of thin air. And this is a problem for all of us. It's something we should really consider. Chapter 14 in this year's book, of course, is a chapter that I co-authored that talks a lot about the importance of media myth-making. And again, that's a lot what we're really dealing with, is we're either dealing with blackout of media coverage or no media coverage of these civil rights issues and civil liberties stories, or we're dealing with incessant myth-making and phony debates. And so what we're here to do, of course, is deconstruct those issues and break through them. And we're very lucky to have speakers coming in to talk about these issues. But again, I'd also like to frame this evening's discussion not as something over the past year. We really need to frame it as something that is in its entirety of American history. It's been an ongoing theme and an ongoing issue of an incessant onslaught against the rights of the people. Again, whether you want to go back to 1798 and the Alien Sedition Acts, if you want to look at the problems of suspension of habeas corpus in the Civil War, the Supreme Court ruled in 1866 that the president does not have the right to suspend habeas corpus even in times of war. And that was during the Civil War. That's pretty significant, but yet it doesn't stop executives from assuming unilateral authority to act politically expediently. And they basically then help the press create these phony debates by challenging not just conventional wisdom, but again, we're challenging almost 800 years of legal tradition. So it's, again, significant. Of course, when we go through history and we see the Espionage Act and Sedition Act of World War I, things like the Palmer Raids and the First and Second Red Scares, the Executive Orders 9066 and Japanese internment in 1942 and World War II, over 100,000 Japanese Americans thrown in prison camps around the country, almost 70% of whom were American citizens that had their rights completely stripped from them. This is not imaginary. This is why we're started going through a walk down what I call memory hole lane. It's the history we ought to know that we seem to not be treated to. And when we have it as context, suddenly issues like H.R. 1955 aren't just bogeymen or conspiracy theorist fodder. They're real things, and these people are really serious about trying to impose them on the public. And we should, again, pay close attention. Of course, we know through the 50s and 60s, whether it was McCarthyism or the House Un-American Activities Committee that lasted from the 1930s to the 1970s until it was shut down by the Frank Church Committee in 1975 and 6, where we had sort of more openness in government that got us the FISA law that candidate Obama just raced back to Washington for not long ago to support restrictions on FISA, sort of rewriting it. It's a further dismantling of the Church Committee rules that started in the Reagan years. And this is, again, an ongoing rollback of a lot of these types of protections. In the 1990s, of course, we can't forget some of the most significant precursors and attacks on civil liberties came under the Clinton years. It's President Clinton, the alleged liberal Democrat that's responsible for the most troops deployed in modern American history. It's President Clinton that's responsible for the most jailed nonviolent drug offenders. It's President Clinton responsible for the neoliberal economic policies that have recently resulted in fiscal catastrophe around the globe. That's not to say he's single-handedly to blame for it. It's just to say that it's a bipartisan effort. These people have both acted in this capacity, and it has significantly affected ordinary people's lives. While the Anti-Terrorism Law of 1996 is clearly the legal precursor of the USA Patriot Act. that came about in October of 2001 in the wake of 9/11, which is one of the most significant onslaughts of civil liberties in American history, wiping out single-handedly pretty much the First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth, Ninth, 10th, and 14th Amendments as they're applied to the citizenry. That's pretty good for one law. 340-odd pages of an onslaught against the rights of the people. And again, not many people seem to have paid a lot of attention. In fact, at the time, you remember Attorney General John Ashcroft in December of 2001, when addressing critics of the Patriot Act, said to those, we'll see if we can find the quote. I don't want to misquote it because it's too good. To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and diminish our resolve. They give ammunition to America's enemies and pause to America's friends. That's spoken from the mouth of the chief law enforcement officer at the Justice Department, talking about a law that wiped out, a good portion of our Bill of Rights. That should be an alarming wake-up call to people. And if we go way back into our history with people like Benjamin Franklin in 1759, I think we get a better model of the importance of civil liberties. Even though Franklin has only attributed this quote, it's actually probably from Richard Jackson. But regardless, Franklin has often had this quote attributed to him: "They that can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." We should consider those ideas. When we allegedly live in a free society, we should consider how much we're willing to barter those very freedoms that we cherish and that we allegedly are fighting for in other parts of the world that we really don't even have. And we can see that pretty clearly tonight when we're going to look very closely at House Resolution 1955. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce this evening's speaker, who is Lindsay Beyerstein, examining the Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act. And this was originally published in These Times. This is, of course, the fourth part of the Modern Media Lecture Series. We have freelance journalist Lindsay Beyerstein. She's here to discuss her award-winning article. This act, H.R. 1955, passed the House in October of 2007 by a vote of 404 to 6. This is pretty significant. This is a law that's largely filled with vague languages to attack homegrown terrorism and a violent radicalization on the home front that leaves interpretations of these terms up to the discretion of the Department of Homeland Security. A very Orwellian term that is as well. Lindsay's here to talk tonight about the development and impetus behind the current, this bill. It's no longer a current bill. It was stalled in the Senate in S. 1959, and Lindsay's going to talk about that. But the coverage it received within the U.S. media, of course, was slim. Lindsay's going to talk more about that as well. She is an investigative journalist. She is currently a national correspondent for Raw Story, investigates where her beat is public corruption and civil liberties. Her reporting has been published in Salon, in These Times, the New York Press, and other outlets. Her photojournalism has appeared in Time, Salon, the Austin American Statesman, and other outlets. In 2007, she delivered the Norman E. Richardson Lecture at the University of Gettysburg on journalism and philosophy. She is a faculty member at the Skeptics Toolbox in the University of Oregon. And again, Lindsay's here to talk to us tonight about story number 6. So please welcome Lindsay Beyerstein.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Can everybody hear me? Is that good? Okay. So I'm here to talk to you about the Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act of 2007, and it's not very suspenseful. It did not. It's now died, but basically what this bill is, there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding the bill. It was brought forth in 2007, voted on in October, and what it is, it's a bill centering around this concept of homegrown terrorism and something that we're going to talk about, the notion of violent radicalization. And basically what the bill is, when you boil it right down, it's two things. It's the creation of a commission to study the concept of violent radicalization and homegrown terrorism. It's going to be it would have been a 10-member commission, and each member of the commission would have been appointed by somebody in the legislative or executive branch, so it would have been a bipartisan commission. The leader of the House, of the House Majority, House Minority, President, head of the Department of Homeland Security, everybody and a number of other dignitaries would have gotten to appoint people of their choice to serve on this committee, which would have had 18 months and a lot of money and resources to go and study the concept of homegrown terrorism and violent radicalization. And they would have produced a report for Congress on their findings. And the second part of the bill was something called the creation of a Center for Excellence for the Study of, say it with me now, violent radicalization and homegrown terrorism prevention. And the price tag for this entire effort was going to be $22 million over 4 years. And it pains me to say that this is an initiative that came up while the Democrats had control of the legislative branch. It was spearheaded by Jane Harman of California, a Democrat. And don't feel bad, my Congresswoman Yvette Clarke co-sponsored the bill, so no hard feelings. Anyway, I'm going to start by just going over the language of the bill itself and in its own words, so you can kind of familiarize yourself with, and the details of the language are going to become very important as we go on. So let's start with definitions. For the purpose of this subtitle, violent radicalization. The term violent radicalization means the process of adopting or promoting an extremist belief system for the purpose of facilitating ideologically based violence to advance political, religious, or social change. Homegrown terrorism. The term homegrown terrorism means the use, planned use, or threatened use of force or violence by a group or individual born, raised, or based and operating primarily within the United States or any possession of the United States to intimidate or coerce the United States government, the civilian population of the United States, or any segment thereof in furtherance of social or political objectives. And then we're going to move along to some of the findings, which sort of the statement of facts, which the legislation say, okay, ex ante, these are the conditions that sort of brought about the need for this bill. So Congress finds that the following. The promotion of violent radicalization, homegrown terrorism, and ideologically based violence exists in the United States and poses a threat to homeland security. So the promotion of violent radicalization, homegrown terrorism, and ideologically based violence exists in the United States and poses a threat to homeland security. Notice how they're saying not that these things, not the homegrown terrorism itself, not the violent radicalization, but it's a meta. The promotion of these things exists. And the promotion, as in people advocating the idea of these things, which are basically themselves ideas, constitute a threat to homeland security, which is not exactly standard and constitutional as far as I can tell, but the second key finding here is that the internet has aided in facilitating violent radicalization, ideologically based violence, and the homegrown terrorism process in the United States by providing access to broad and constant streams of terrorist-related propaganda in the United States. While the United States must continue its vigilant efforts to combat international terrorism, it must also strengthen efforts to combat the threat posed by homegrown terrorists based and operating in the United States. Preventing the potential rise of self-radicalized, unaffiliated terrorists domestically cannot easily be accomplished solely through traditional federal intelligence or law enforcement efforts and can benefit from the incorporation of state and local efforts. Individuals prone to violent radicalization, homegrown terrorism, and ideologically based violence span all races, ethnicities, and religious beliefs. And individuals should not be targeted based solely on their race, ethnicity, or religion. And any measure taken to prevent violent radicalization, homegrown terrorism, and ideologically based violence and homegrown terrorism in the United States should not violate constitutional rights, civil liberties, or the United States citizens in lawful permanent rights of lawful permanent residence. Okay, so basically that's an introduction to the phenomena of interest. And there are a number of things that raise great concern about this bill. And the first of which is the idea that it's targeting these ideas, that constitutionally you're supposed to be allowed to think possibly dangerous thoughts and to discuss them with others, and even to advocate in the abstract the idea of violence. For instance, it's not a crime to be a classic Marxist communist who believes that in the abstract it would be a good idea to violently to violently change the government. As long as you don't say where and when you're planning to do it, it's still, constitutionally protected speech. But the homegrown terrorism, the violent radicalization idea, is basically a license. It's an entree by the state to start looking very carefully at stuff that really is constitutionally protected speech and is not actions, is not actual deviant behavior, is not actual violence. And of course, it's also looking at associations, because what they're really talking about specifically here is the internet. What Harman seems to be most concerned about is the idea of Salafist jihadis, as they like to say, congregating in internet chat rooms and fomenting violent ideas. So this is, it seems to be a direct, it's not yet an assault, because basically all we're talking about is a commission to study something at this point. But it's a direct overstep, it's a direct questioning of something that would normally be considered off limits. And in terms of the framing, in terms of the rhetoric, how they go about doing this, it's interesting, because they've reified this thing called radicalization. And what is radicalization? Well, radicalization, they've decided that there's one thing that is a process from thinking bad things to committing crimes. And thereby, that justifies that they've got this idea that there's a process, and the process itself is deviant. So there's one radicalization process that they can study with their commission. And that this process is itself deviant. So the idea is, well, it's not, even when you start out at the beginning of it thinking these deviant thoughts, it's not just the deviant protected thoughts, it's part of a whole deviant radicalization process, so it becomes more acceptable, more thinkable, more appropriate in their minds, and people testified to this in Congress, the idea that it's okay for the government to start monitoring and even intervening at the earliest stages of radicalization. And when you think about it, any thought that's considered deviant or potentially violent, or that could lead to violence, could be construed as the earliest stages of a radicalization process. So that's sort of the philosophical, rights-based objections to the bill. And then there's some really important sort of practical legal details about why this is a cause for concern. Because basically what they're doing, they're setting up a commission to study stuff. But it's under Title VIII of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. So this is specifically the Department of Homeland Security doing this research, the feds. This is a law enforcement agency with cabinet authority. And that's somewhat disconcerting. Why is it that they want the Homeland Security Department to be doing this research? Why do they think they need this presidential commission within Homeland Security? And the answer a lot of people that I interviewed for the story seem to think is because it gives them an opportunity to do an end run around a lot of constitutional protections in terms of privacy. For good reason, there are all kinds of legal controls about what a law enforcement agency can do to study you, to study your group, what kind of information they can gather and why. Whereas if you construe it as being an academic fact-finding exercise, there's a lot fewer regulations. But there's still, if you want to do it as, within, say, the bounds of a university, there are, within those sort of civilian disciplines, protections for subjects. And what they're trying to do, functionally, what this commission would have done would be to create a kind of free-for-all of these sort of semi-public, semi-private think tanks. This is how they've set up the centers of excellence before, within an academic institution, but not really of an academic institution, so that a lot of their research would not be covered by the existing protections that apply to a university. But they also wouldn't officially be law enforcement. So if the Center of Excellence decided to do a study on, mosques in the area, and they were to want to say, share that information. I mean, every third word in here is about information sharing between state, local, and tribal levels of government. Well, say if they want to share that information in the study, there's nothing in here that says that they couldn't do that. In fact, they're basically officially encouraged to share their information as broadly as possible. So there's the concern about the idea of shifting research into this kind of weird amalgam of law enforcement and outside of the traditional protections that govern academic research. Another problem is that this is the idea of creating these little special ideologically based fiefdoms within research, because there's a lot of effort that's already going on in terms of tracking down domestic terrorists and studying domestic terrorists. On the law enforcement side, you've got the FBI, you've got intelligence agencies that are monitoring domestic terrorists with international connections, you've got the police in any given city, then you've got also community groups, active, the Anti-Defamation League, let's say, deals with white supremacists. You've got the Southern Poverty Law Center, you've got Amnesty International, you've got the Simon Wiesenthal Center, you've got a whole sort of non-profit sector of people that are studying the motives and tactics of extremist groups. So, and then there's, of course, any number of disciplines in mainstream academia, from cultural anthropology to math and social networking theory, that are studying in their own rigorous ways, often with federal support, through various grants that are administered through peer review. So these topics are being addressed, and you have to stop and wonder why. Why is it so important that you get these 10 political appointees to channel money into this special center for excellence, instead of just saying, well, we'll give the money to the National Science Foundation, we'll give the money to the FBI, we'll give the money to grants for anthropology graduate students. And the reason is that you're taking it again outside of the realm of peer review and control. So if you're a scientist, say you're an anthropologist and you want to study the militia movement, you've got to go and get approval from your own institution, and then if you want to get your findings published anywhere or presented anywhere, you have to go through the normal peer review process to get a platform for your ideas, and you have to go through the channels of your discipline. Whereas with these centers for excellence, they are not necessarily they don't allocate their resources based on peer review, and they don't necessarily even participate in the peer review processes that you would ordinarily expect these quasi-academic efforts to be part of. So you're getting essentially, there's a propaganda function here too. You're creating these quote-unquote centers of excellence with an academic patina, but everybody who's there, everybody who's funded, and how everybody is judged is by essentially political purposes. So that's another cause for concern. Also, there's no real oversight of the commission itself. I mean, I read to you those articles in the items at the beginning that say, well, this shouldn't be targeting anybody, this shouldn't be discriminating against anybody, we shouldn't be saying anybody's particular religion, not to mention any names, Islam. But there's really nothing in there about any kind of oversight that this committee would have. I mean, if these political appointees decided that they were going to study something that seemed to be totally outside the law, nobody would notice. There would be no way, there would be no review. It would just get turned over to Congress as far as I can tell from the reading of the bill. Now, let's see. Another kind of interesting thing that's of concern about these about this legislation is that the people who participated in, and not coincidentally, they tend to belong to other centers of excellence, which also seem to have overlapping mandates, and they get up, and they also tend to be fellows of various kinds of think tanks, essentially pretty right-wing organizations, private, typically 501c3 nonprofits. And if you look at their resumes, they often tend to have worked in the Department of Homeland Security, or as lobbyists for companies in the Homeland Security industrial complex, or as academics, sometimes in legitimate institutions, but more often as fellows in these think tanks. If you go and pull the 990 forms for these think tanks, you notice that two things: that they don't have to disclose who funds them, and two, that they do have to disclose who they pay, and they seem to exist largely to pay very good consulting honoraria to people who used to work at the Department of Homeland Security or big Homeland Security companies. And if you look at what these people do all day, they go and testify before Congress. And you guys probably know, if you want to be paid to influence Congress, generally speaking, if you're engaging in certain kinds of communications with Congress, you have to register under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, and you have to be regulated, you have to file paperwork. But if you want to be a quote-unquote fellow at a quote-unquote think tank that just happens to be funded by Lockheed Martin or L3 or one of those, and they never have to say, nobody knows. You don't see where the money's coming from, generally speaking. But you can be one of these experts who used to work at Homeland Security and get up in front of Congress and say, yes, from my cushy consulting job, I say it would be absolutely excellent if we were way more afraid of terrorism, specifically an expensive kind of terrorism to fight. something that maybe we make some products for. And so you've got this whole basic, and that's another item of concern about these kinds of commissions, is that they're creating avenues for undisclosed lobbying attempts with obscure funding that wouldn't be allowed if you were to just have companies go and plead their cases in front of Congress themselves. And of course, that's again adding this patina of academic institutional respectability to what's pretty naked political gamesmanship in a lot of cases. And again, there are no safeguards as to whose voices get heard. You have politicians appointing members of committees based on political criteria. And even if they're qualified people, I'm not saying that everybody who is a politician who's in a position to make these appointments is going to be ignorant or is going to be derelict in their duties, but at the same time, it's like, who are the politicians likely to think are important? Well, people who have already been Washington officials, people who are captains of industry. You're not going to get somebody from the Southern Poverty Law Center, even though they probably know more about the actual domestic terrorists operating in the US today than, Mary Bauer from the Southern Poverty Law Center is going to come and talk to you next week. And, Mary and her colleagues are an absolute font of knowledge about real live domestic terrorists that are actually hurting and killing people today, but that nobody from there is ever going to end up on one of those committees, not even the most liberal members of Congress, because it's just not the done thing. And of course, you've got this sort of transfer, ever narrowing of acceptable discourse until you finally get to these appointees and their projects that they farm out to other people in the same system. And so you end up perpetuating really unexamined biases. There's no way that the public certainly can, and once we know more about it, if the media were doing a better job, can criticize the appointees. But even then, it's when you put appointees in charge of these kinds of decisions, it's a structural problem, because even the most informed citizens can't be vetting there are 10 of these people for this one small commission alone. We can't be vetting all of them. The idea is that there really should be and it's good that we're studying the idea of extremists in America. I'm not trying to downplay the idea that there are people, criminals, abortion clinic bombers, any number of groups that are potentially just plain old ordinary criminals that need to be studied. It's good to study them, but we really should be concerned about avenues of funding creating these little fiefdoms within political organizations. Something similar is happening at the Defense Department right now. They're trying to create this project called Minerva, which is outside the normal stream of National Science Foundation funding to study, again, topics of interest to the Defense Department, political action in China, again, terrorist organizations. It's sort of a laundry list of topics that you would think would legitimately be of interest to the Department of Defense, but there are robust research programs going on outside all over academia. And it's not like these guys don't have a lot of money. It's not like they couldn't, fly these people out to come and talk to their generals. It's not like they couldn't afford to buy their books. But instead, you've got this constant structural drive to create these fiefdoms that have the patina of academic responsibility, that have the patina of respectability, but are in fact supported politically and defended politically and become nexuses of power and communication. You're basically taking what should be research and turning it into a communications arm of the military-industrial complex. And you don't have to believe in conspiracies to believe that this is true. You just look at it's in everybody's best interest. This is what everybody who's participating in this process would reasonably, rationally want for themselves. And the results of what they do tends to reinforce their own power and influence. So these things are very stable kinds of systems that just seem to set themselves up and perpetuate themselves. So I'm going to, let's see. The next thing I'm going to talk about actually is kind of a case study that I was lucky enough to attend the 2 National Parties conventions this summer. I work as a campaign reporter for a blog called Fire Dog Lake. I run their campaign, their sub-blog called The Campaign Silo. And so I covered the 2 conventions, and it was really interesting to me. We always seem to debate and discuss issues like the Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act as if they were the beginning of a slippery slope, as if we're saying, well, there are a lot of people we don't like that they're messing with now, but who might they bother in the future? And what I was able to observe at these conventions in terms of how the security apparatus treated the demonstrators and how the police interfaced with the media and the general public, we're already way down deep in the morass. We've already slipped down the slippery slope. The idea of homegrown terrorism being used to justify all kinds of civil rights abuses is already here. This is kind of a funny story. It happened just after I got in. It was the Friday afternoon before the Republican convention was going to start in St. Paul. And I was sitting in my hotel room. I'd just gotten in. I was kicking off my shoes and dialing a couple of numbers. I'd gotten some tips about various people that were active in the activist community. And my plan was to just call up this guy, Mike, and say, hey, have you guys been having any trouble with the police? Are you hearing anything? I'm sort of seeing these tweets come across Twitter and various things on the indie media saying that cops are giving people a hard time. Have you heard anything about this? So I call the guy up, and so I said, are you having any trouble with the police? And he says, oh, they're here right now. I said, what do you mean they're here right now? They're outside my house, he said. I'm having eyewitness video, is that what they're called, guys? They're the protest monitors that actually got a bunch of people off during the Republican National Convention in New York by documenting police brutality. So Mike is a sort of local fixture on the progressive scene, and also really into teaching free Irish folk dancing lessons, which will become important later in this story. But being a public-spirited kind of guy, Mike decided that and he's a duplex, so he decided that he was going to let some folks from out of town, including some legal observers and some eyewitness media folks, stay on the other side of his duplex. So he'd been out, I said, estate sailing, which is Minnesotan for going to garage sales, and he'd gotten home, and he was eating lunch, and about 30 or 40 policemen just charged through my flower bed and destroyed it with their automatic weapons drawn. And when the woman next door, who was answered the door next door, asked to see a warrant, she was led off. So Mike's sort of sitting up at his upstairs with his two roommates, watching this whole thing unfold through his window. And I said, Mike, are you scared? He's like, no, I'm a veteran. Because I was pretty scared about this whole thing. And he said, yeah, actually, I was a military police officer, and I can tell you I wouldn't have done this. So this entire media circus is kind of developing outside, where his city councilman is showing up and holding a small impromptu press conference. And so I got off the phone with Mike because I figured he was probably pretty busy at that point, and I didn't want to monopolize his time. And so, call me if anything. And it turned out that about 2 seconds after I'd hung up the phone and gone off to blog this post, the police had broken through the attic on the opposite side. Their warrant had been for the wrong address, but they didn't want to admit it. So what they did instead, because there was this minor media circus going on outside with the aldermen and stuff, they had gone upstairs, taken everybody inside, put them out in the backyard in flex cuffs, and then broken through the wall of the attic above to come down and get Mike and his friends so they wouldn't have to admit that they hadn't gotten a warrant for the other side of the duplex. And they went and basically they detained everybody in the yard for a couple hours, and just despite having sent in an entire SWAT team, yielded no arrests, seized nothing happened. And later on they tried to, the various federal, state, and local authorities who were involved in this, and there were about 4 different police forces represented in this stunning display of law enforcement. And they went to the St. Paul City Council and said, the St. Paul City Council, why were you doing this? And they said, well, this guy's a notorious terrorist. And they said, not him. He's had every woman in St. Paul in his arms. He teaches us all folk dancing. He's not a terrorist. So the big shot counterterrorism task force kind of got laughed out of court on that one. But it was really interesting because this was just the Friday before the convention got started, and you could see, and there were a whole bunch of different raids that kept happening beforehand. And basically, what was going on is the police would do a raid, and then whatever they'd managed to net, they would go on TV with it and say, "Look, these people are dangerous terrorists. Look what we found." And they would do things like they would raid sort of ordinary suburban homes in Minneapolis and say, "Look, we found paint. We found nails. We found a hatchet and a rusty machete and some gasoline," and they'd kind of go through the contents of a garden shed. Say, "Look at all this stuff that we found that was clearly weapons. This could have been, they had glass bottles and rags. And, these could have been Molotov cocktails." And so they would justify the idea of whatever they wanted to do. And of course, these are all SWAT team raids. And I interviewed a guy who used to run a SWAT team, and I said, what are the conditions under which it's acceptable to even use a SWAT team? And he said, well, you have to have real evidence that these are hardcore criminals because, you know, SWAT raids kill people. They kill police officers and they kill, you know, often kill the people inside. And they really shouldn't do them unless you're convinced that you've got hardcore people making pipe bombs or larger, he said. Or basically sort of serial rapists, murderers, drug dealers type people, not anti-globalization protesters. But they went and did this again and again, The refrain was, these are terrorists. These are, you know, basically domestic terrorists. These are extremists. These are violent people. And they had this steady drumbeat. I got woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call. They'd gone to a house, and a bunch of explosives people had just kind of seized on the car and essentially dismantled it on the street. Finding no explosives, they just said, oh, sorry. So they were down a car. So there was this continual campaign of harassment, and they were using the harassment as their own form of political theater, essentially. That they would go and say, look, we know that these people are dangerous because we called our bomb squad and we dismantled their car. And we must have had a good reason, right? So by the time the actual, you know, the big protests on Labor Day happened, the public had been completely convinced that these people were dangerous radicals who didn't deserve to have any civil rights. And as soon as anything went wrong during the protest, they already had this frame in place where they could say, well, these are obviously violent people, and they would construe anything that went wrong as being violent. And they really weren't, I went and looked at the arrest statistics, and they weren't quite complete when I looked at them, but there were no arrests for sort of personal acts of violence. There were no assault charges. There was no attempted murder. There was no weapons charges, no interpersonal violence that seemed to show up on the rap sheets as I looked at them from the county. And yet the buzzword that you heard on the media over and over and over again was the protest turned violent. And what happened was the protest, and I was there sort of running around in the streets, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, you know, with the protesters. And essentially there were a lot of regular just street protesters with signs, and they were about 60, you know, pretty hardcore anarchist folks that really wanted to do some what I would call public mischief. I mean, they turned over a lot of newspaper boxes. They broke a few department store windows. Another like key literal framing issue is that they had the same window from the Macy's department store that was broken, you know, shown on every single major network. It showed up on the front pages of British papers and Polish papers, and it was all the same shot too. It was the same tight shot because essentially it was some idiot threw a rock through the Macy's window, and somebody else broke a window at the UBS bank a few blocks down, and there was some, you know, there's probably a couple $1,000s worth of damage, but there were 12,000 protesters, and 60 people actually broke the law. And yet it was blown out in the idea, because they'd done this, these are dangerous radicals. They'd done this whole prodromal weekend thing where they were reminding everybody again and again that these were incredibly dangerous people, when there had been no evidence that they were dangerous at all. But the narrative had gotten to the point where they were justifying all kinds of really blatant civil rights abuses to the protesters because they'd set the stage for the idea that everything they did was going to be violent. They ended up corralling a bunch of protesters. This was a tactic that I saw used again and again at the RNC, was where the police would lure protesters, often by flat-out deceit, into a confined area and then cordon off the entry and access points and then issue an order to dismiss. So to disperse. And when people failed to disperse, they would arrest people because they'd failed to disperse. And this actually happened to me a couple days later. I was covering a protest, and there was this gathering called the Poor People's March. And by the time they got to me where I was standing, they were pretty tired, and I couldn't even tell that they actually were protesters. I had to go back and look at my photos. So yeah, I guess they are holding some signs. But the police blocked off both ends of the block and then yelled, disperse. By the time, and dump trucks were literally moving in to further block any more distant exits. And they didn't end up making any arrests at all. They just tear gassed everybody in the intersection. So, and later on the news, you would hear these reports. In fact, people on progressive media listservs that I belonged to were trying to tell me, oh no, they were violent protesters, and they could have just gone down the other way. I said, no, actually, I tried to do that, and a horse cop lunged at me and told me to get back. It's not true. So, and there were about 300 people arrested at the Labor Day protest down here on the access road by the river. St. Paul overlooks the Mississippi River, and this is the lower level where they conducted the mass arrests. And they did the same thing on the last night, which was John McCain's big night, but it was even more insidious because they They were abused. They'd lied to people about their marching permits. People had permits, and I was calling every hour to see what the current story was about how late the permit was good till. And they made this big deal about having a joint communications access system that you had to call and talk to a spokesman who would give you the absolute authoritative truth that would stand for everybody at this particular moment. And every time I called them, I would get a different answer as to how late the permit was good for. And so they told the people on the ground at about 5 p.m., if memory served, that their permit had expired, which was not what they told me. But they said, okay, you can stay as long as you're peaceful. And why don't you go over onto this bridge? And if you look at the pictures, these are some really authoritative looking cops. There's really nothing else to do, but why don't you go over onto this bridge? And so when they did, there were about 300 people on the bridge. They blocked off both ends. And this wasn't just protesters. This was working press. This was people with kids. There's people who just happened to want to go over this bridge for some other reason. And they flex cuffed everybody face down on the bridge, about 200 to 300 people, and arrested them all. And again, this was one of I think the big unreported story of the RNC was the story of the protests. And what I was getting when I was talking to, just sort of ordinary people in Minneapolis is like, good, we're glad because these are such dangerous people. And there was nothing that you could say to these folks, and there was nothing you could say to the press either. There were a lot of working press. In fact, a Fox News crew got gassed. We didn't hear about it. It kind of fell off the radar. And Donna Brazil, the Democratic strategist and media personality, got pepper sprayed in front of a landmark diner, and that just kind of dissipated too. So it really was, the whole experience was just really illustrative to me about how it is that defining people as radicals and defining people as potentially violent can be used as a really excellent pretext to silence people, to delegitimize whatever their message is, and then also to take away further rights from them and this is, I think, a really good illustration of why we should be concerned about measures like the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Prevention Act, because it legitimizes the government's interest in institutionalizing and pathologizing all kinds of dissent, that it creates, an authoritative report, a commission, a stamp of the idea that this is a problem, and our job is to go find out who meets this definition of a problem, and then we can come up with solutions for intervening against them. And so I was very gratified when it turned out that the bill did not pass. It passed by such an overwhelming margin in the House, and everyone was expecting it to sail through the Senate, and I really don't know why it didn't. I would like to think that it had to do with the very strong sort of outpouring of criticism there was a lot in the alternative media, especially on the blogs, and there was some really good coverage actually in Congressional Quarterly, strangely enough, which is actually very influential on the Hill. It was savage for just being a really redundant boondoggle, and I think that may have changed some minds. And Delia Lithwick took a really great leadership role in terms of criticizing it in Slate. She wrote a really terrific, funny column that I think reached a lot of people. But for whatever reason, it bogged down in committee, and in May, Joe Lieberman was trying to revive it, and he picked a big fight with Google, and you can read the details in the Project Censored book. But basically, he got his staffers to find a couple dozen videos on YouTube that appeared to be jihadist propaganda. And they found, YouTube gets hundreds of thousands of uploads every day, and they don't have a human being sitting there searching to look and make sure everything that goes on YouTube is okay. So they have a peer rating. So if you see something on YouTube that violates their terms of service, whether it's violent or depicts a crime, or it shows something that's, outside their broad standards of decency, like, say, dismembered bodies or something like that, and copyright infringement, you report it, and then the YouTube humans look at it, and if it does violate these conditions, then they take it down. But so Lieberman got a whole potpourri of stuff that he said was, pro-jihad and unacceptable, and Google, YouTube, the same company, looked at these things and said, well, some of these really are violent, or they infringe on copyright, or they're otherwise unacceptable. We're going to take those down, but the majority of them are just fine. Yes, they say go jihad, and we're not condoning that, but we're not going to take them down. And Lieberman stomped his feet and exchanged angry letters with Google and YouTube and told them that they were ruining civilization and stuff. And Google just stood firm and said, no, they don't violate our terms of service, so we're not going to do. And Lieberman was forced to back down. And the really great part was the New York Times absolutely excoriated Lieberman in an op-ed. And I would like to think that the alternative media had a lot to do with kind of priming what was, moving the window of acceptable discourse to the point where a mainstream paper could say, yes, you've really overstepped. This is not acceptable. You can't be pulling things off YouTube. And that was generally observers credited sort of that defeat of, finally putting the bill to bed for the remainder of this legislative session. But the problem is we really can't afford to be complacent because this was a bill that came up under Democratic control of the legislative branch. And my feeling is that it may have been a tactical retreat because there's a lot of optimism that the Democrats are going to retake the executive branch in November, which means that they'll have a Democratic president and a Democratic Secretary of Homeland Security, which is 20% of the people on the commission. And, wise people in the Senate may have thought, well, we would rather have everybody be the people we want instead of just 80% of them. So I would predict that it could very well come roaring back up in our faces again next time around, so we can't be complacent.